On the day this podcast was recorded, Canada was captivated by the World Series, and the Jays had just won Game 5 to take a 3-2 lead. Meanwhile, two different scandals were just breaking out in the NBA. One where well-known athletes were partnering with organized crime in rigged poker games, and one involving players and coaches leaking inside information to gamblers. 20 years ago, those scandals would have been cut and dried, but today they're a lot more murky. Professional sports partnerships with predatory gambling companies have blurred the lines, and they've made the players in those leagues the de facto face of sports gambling. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is the CPA podcast Mindful. My guests today are returning to the podcast as sports gambling is in the spotlight. They first spoke here a year and a half ago about the urgent need to regulate sports gambling and in particular to do away with the flood of ads that impact children in particular in negative and devastating ways. Today, the legislation they were advocating to see is on its way through the House of Commons.
Well, I'm Bruce Kidd. I'm a retired professor at the University of Toronto, and I'm currently the chair of an NGO, the Campaign to Ban Ads for Gambling, trying to address the escalating harms created by the growing sports betting industry.
I'm Steve Joordens. I'm a professor of psychology at University of Toronto, also a sports fan, also somebody who was really troubled by seeing all the sports gambling ads. And when I heard that my friend Bruce was leading a charge to do something about it, I joined with him as soon as I could and do what I can to help.
We spoke about this some time ago. We're revisiting it now because this is even more so in the news than it ever has been. I want to go back a little bit, sort of to the beginning of this, because I realized just how quickly this has all happened, right? It was really 2018 where the United States legalized sports betting. And in 7 years, that's the explosion that we've seen. And it just occurred to me, I saw The Last Boy Scout on my TV and I thought, oh yeah, I used to love that movie. And then I remembered that the big bad guy in The Last Boy Scout with Bruce Willis and Damon Wayans was an NFL owner whose evil plan was to legalize sports gambling. That was the, plan that they had to thwart with and it was very shortly after that they went ahead and actually did legalize sports gambling, and here we are today. So I'm hoping that, Bruce, let's start with you. I mean, the speed with which this has happened, has that made it harder to combat, or has it really highlighted the dangers that are inherent in it so quickly?
Well, the growth has been phenomenal. There's so much money involved. There's so many interests that are seeking to profit from it that it has exploded exponentially. And at a time when sports organizations are hurting for revenue, when the traditional media is hurting for revenue, many enablers have held their nose, turned a blind eye to the harms to jump on the bandwagon. I mean, to jump ahead, I don't know whether it's fair to say that all of the professional sport leagues and franchises were eager to do this. But when the U.S. Supreme Court legalized sports betting across the U.S. in 2018, they jumped on the bandwagon. Would they have, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but would some of the more responsible owners have resisted if it wasn't legalized by a Supreme Court decision? In Canada, it was the gambling industry that said, all of our customers are going to the United States in the now legalized market. You've got to help us by legalizing it in Canada. And that's what happened in 2021 in the House of Commons, in Parliament, despite all of the evidence internationally about the harms, despite all of the cautions that other countries were putting in place. The Canadian Parliament rushed into open, uncritical legalization. They did so by enabling the provinces and territories to create those markets. By comparison, in 2018, I believe, I forget these dates sometimes, that same parliament legalized cannabis. They banned the ads. So they saw that there were arguments for legalization, but they did not want to encourage the spread of the use of a problematic product, and so they banned the ads. But in the case of sports betting, it was wide open, and we've seen the ads, a virtual tsunami of ads, at times of the World Series, at times of major events. They're in your face. And of course, all of the evidence is that they drive participation in sports betting. And those numbers have risen so fast that it's very hard to keep up with them. But and I'll just end with this. But the survey research indicates that the harms are growing by leaps and bounds in step with the growth of the industry. The last report that Canada Mental Health Research published a year ago showed that 7% of Canadians who engaged in betting and gambling are addicted. Their most recent report last month reported that number has grown to 9%. That's a 2% growth in 1 year, and we're talking millions of people.
Yeah, that's a big number. Steve, I'm wondering from a psychological perspective, do you know if that growth is simply attributed to more people starting to gamble and therefore more people having the opportunity to become addicted to it? Or is it that the gambling is becoming a little more targeted? Is it more addictive than it was before? To what do you attribute this?
Well, I mean, first of all, just the normalization of it, the fact that it's just been out there and you asked with the speed with which this marketing happened and everything, does that matter? Absolutely. I kind of see it like these dog eating vines, those vegetation that climb other trees, but then embed themselves and wrap themselves around them. And so now it's very hard to ever pull that out. We've got this sports marketing just embedded in every sporting event that goes on that we watch with our children. And it is largely more problematic for children whose brains have not developed. The reward systems have not developed well. They're very short-term, present focused. And that's what all the ads hit. That's what they play to. And yeah, absolutely. We're finding that very young children, as Bruce said, if we look at the 18 to 34-year-old category, that's 15% who declare they have a gambling issue. And we know with addiction, often right, there are people that are just not declaring it. So, we may be at like 1 of 5 children who have a serious gambling problem. And of those people with gambling problems, about 1 in 5 are contemplating things like suicide, because the gambling isn't just an addiction. It's an addiction that sucks money. Right. And that right, money has to somehow come from somewhere. So for every addict, we also have their families now being pulled in. Anywhere from 4 to 8 other people are affected by every addict on this. So, I mean, the scale of this is amazing. But I do think what one message Bruce and I want to highlight throughout here is we can do something about this. There's so many problems in the world, so many terrible things going on that we feel powerless to do anything about. This needn't be one of them. We have a mechanism. There's a bill in the House with enough outcry from the public. We can actually change the way things are happening, and we can protect our youth from a lot of this.
Yeah, and I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm speaking to the two of you right now with the Blue Jays in the World Series, and Canada is watching this, and then we're all engaged. We're all invested in the Blue Jays doing well. And right now they have a 3-2 lead by the time that this gets published. The World Series will be over. Hopefully we'll be champions. But is that, I imagine it's sort of a double-edged sword when it comes to sports gambling. That means that so many kids who otherwise wouldn't be invested. I remember when I was a kid in 1992 and 93, the Blue Jays were in the World Series. That was everything. That was my whole world. I was a little kid who was just, obsessed with this. I'm sure there are kids doing that now. It exposes them to this risk, but is this maybe also an opportunity to warn people, to have more people engaged in the discussion about sports gambling?
Well, certainly there should be public education about the harms, the risks, and what to do. And to counter the normalization of sports betting that is uncontested right now. I mean, what drives me crazy is that people say you can't enjoy sports unless you bet.
Right.
That's crazy. Canadians enjoyed Major League Baseball for more than a century without baseball being a sport on which you could legally place a bet. So number one, there has to be public education. I mean, the anti-smoking campaign was successful because of public service announcements that demonstrated the harms and demonstrated what you could do to get help. There's none of that right now. So that's number one. Banning the ads is number two. That's really, really important. I would think educational programs, and I'm working with people in the Ontario government about a curriculum kit that would provide more information. It's a complicated because it's very much involved. I don't have my cell phone right here, but it's very much involved with the growth of the digital media. That cell phone has become a handheld casino. I mean, it causes problems in schools. Steve and others talk about the other forms of addiction that come with the handheld phone, the way it complicates education, the way it complicates family life, and so on. So it's a related problem, but it has to be addressed in that context.
And I think that's maybe the first step, Eric, is education around what a psychological addiction is, because I think the general public kind of gets that, okay, alcohol potentially dangerous, THC potentially dangerous, and so we shouldn't be marketing or pushing these potentially dangerous things. But for some reason, psychological addictions, like those to betting, like those to video games, many people have children who are addicted to video games and sacrificing their social life. These can be just as damaging. Again, the suicide websites now are being primarily trafficked by problem gamblers. So it's a serious thing. And just to give people a taste of, why or how can it be so serious? You really get this point where dopamine is released now when people bet. It's the anticipation of winning that releases the dopamine. So the moment they bet on an app, they start to think, "Oh, I could win," and they're riding this dopamine wave until they crash. And they don't win, they lose, they feel terrible. But if they bet again, they can get back on that train. And so there's this really strong urge to keep betting. And of course, as I say, you're losing money. When we talk about how many entities are benefiting from this, every now and then I think I step back and say, if there's all this much money to go around, where is all that money coming from? Well, it's coming from the pockets of our children and often people who just cannot afford to be doing this. And so, when media outlets don't want to talk about this story, and some of them don't because they are as embedded in it as others, when major league teams don't want to talk about it openly because they are as embedded, we've got a real problem of getting that communication out. How do we get that public discussion happening when there's all these people who would rather just, close their ears and have it not talked about? And I think that's the major challenge we're facing. And by the way, let me just say thank you for hosting this podcast and giving us this opportunity to talk about it.
Well, I'm super fascinated about it right now because there's this big scandal in the NBA and, it feels like the logical conclusion to the league becoming embedded with the gambling apps and the gambling community and that sort of thing. And Bruce, you mentioned that, Canadians have been enjoying Major League Baseball for 100 years without this. And I think baseball had such a shock in the early years. 1919, the White Sox throwing the World Series, the huge scandal that came out of that. And they were so hardcore about it for years. I read a story recently that Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle were banned from baseball because they were working as goodwill ambassadors for a casino. And just the appearance of impropriety in that circumstance. This is long after they'd finished their career, right? If Willie Mays played today, he'd make $700 million like Shohei Ohtani does, and right? But he didn't in his day, and this is one of the ways he could supplement his income. And, he's going to go talk to kids in hospitals. He's working for Easter Seals, but under the umbrella with this little logo of a casino attached to it. That's too much for baseball. They banned their two biggest stars in the 80s. And then as soon as the Supreme Court decision happens, Major League Baseball's big partner is the MGM. And, overnight, the whole thing changes. And I don't know, maybe I'm off on a tangent now. I just read about that and I found that fascinating. But now we have this massive scandal in basketball, which seems like just part and parcel of where the game is.
How do you disrupt what Steve and I call the normalization, the romanticization, the allure that the stars bring to it? I think that you can point out the scandals, the increasing match fixing, game manipulation scandals, which are being reported all over the world in almost every sport we can mention. I think that's one thing that needs to be talked about. It is unsavory. It is unsporting. It is illicit. I think that's number one. I think we need to talk about the abuse that disgruntled or disappointed bettors pour on athletes who don't make their prop bets or their quota bets. But most of all, I think we need to talk about the harms. We're thinking about a slogan to address to the sports bodies and to the governments involved: own the harm. Own the harm. Take responsibility for the well-documented mental health harms, the social costs, the economic costs, the personal costs, the research that Steve cited that shows that 5 to 8 people are affected by every individual who succumbs to problem gambling. We need a public awareness of what the consequences of the sports betting industry now. At the moment, it's got this aura of something that adds allure to sports. If you love sports, you want to bet. But it's harmful, and that's the message that we have to make. And we have to make it as widely as possible. And we need to hold, I saw the other day that someone has initiated a class action suit in the United States to hold a betting company responsible for the harms in a related institution. If that starts to grow, I think that will be an effective counter argument, because it's not just fun. It's not just excitement. We're talking about real social and economic damage. There are no clean corners in sports betting.
Right.
Yeah.
Steve, I'm thinking now, how do you reach people who are doing this? And it has to be through the phones. And, you mentioned how the phones make gambling so prevalent, right? I get, 1975, if you wanted to make a bet, you had to go down to your local shady bookie, and you could presumably bet, well, I think that the Ottawa Senators are going to beat the Toronto Maple Leafs tonight, and that's your bet. Those are your options. Do they win? Do they lose? Right? Now you have your phone where every second of the game you can make a bet on something new that's about to happen. And Steve, you were talking about the dopamine hit that you get when you place the bet. Yep. Well, if you're placing a bet on something that's happening in the next 30 seconds, right? Will this running back get over 4 yards on this play? Oh, no, that didn't work out. Okay, well, I'm going to predict that he'll get sacked on the next play or whatever, right? Yep. Does that change the relationship with the dopamine in your head, in that the rewards are coming faster and faster, and therefore presumably the dopamine hit stays at a high for a longer period of time?
Yeah, it's just all of those barriers that would maybe make somebody a little more hesitate. Like when we talk about your shady bar, that shady bar is also characterized by a bunch of shady characters that you walk in and you look around and you think, do I identify with these people? Is this, and so right. It kind of gives you a feeling of, but now when you can just pull out your sexy phone with a nice ad that's all glittery, and you have the person on TV who's saying, hey, here's what I'm betting on, here's what I think should happen, then yes, the temptation is strong. The barrier to doing it is very low. pull out your phone, click that button. There you've got that dopamine run going. And then, yeah, if it stops, you can turn it back on pretty quickly. And often that short-term mindset, prevents people from seeing the bigger picture of how much money they might be losing and where this is going. And in fact, the other really nasty thing psychologically is there's this notion in people's minds that they should win a certain percent of the time, especially if in sports, if they believe they have some expertise. That, I know sport, I know how this works. I'm going to win a certain percent of the time. And now if you don't, as those losses build, you become more and more convinced that the next win is just around the corner. So rather than having losses kind of fatigue you and have you say, oh no, I got to stop, I've been losing too much. Instead, the psychological reaction is, I have to keep betting, because if I stop now, I'm going to miss out on that win that's waiting for me just around the corner. And so they're constantly pulled to make that next bet, even if they're losing and losing and losing and losing. In fact, maybe more if they're losing and losing and losing.
Right. I mean, what happens if they do get that win? What happens when that win arrives?
Yeah, when that win arises, that that notion of confirmation bias, it's like, I know what I'm doing. I'm going to make money off this. There, I just did. And so they pay a lot of attention to the things that fit with their mental beliefs, and a win sort of fuels that notion that I'm good at this. And they pay very little attention to the things that don't fit with their beliefs, like all of those losses that are building up. So it's this, they're being simultaneously pushed and pulled to just continue playing. And by the way, let's just also mention, this is at a time when so many of our youth have levels of social anxiety that make it very difficult for them to interact with other human beings and do the things that many of us did when we were young. Sport can help with that, by the way. Sport has many beautiful sides. And so this being alone with your phone, watching something like a sporting event, it just really is a dangerous soup of situations our youth are in now. And certainly we should not be pushing them towards dangerous behaviors in this situation. And I think that's, Bruce has owned the harm. The first step to owning the harm is to stop pushing people in the hole, and then pulling them out and trying to recompense them somehow. We have to just stop the pushing as a first start. And that should be blatantly obvious. And if our voices were loud, I think we could have something done. So there, as we mentioned, there's a bill in the House, Bill 211. We want to encourage people to go to banadsforgambling.ca. Let me get that right. To find out what Bruce is doing and other things, but write to your MPs. Let them know you want to see some change, because we have the tool to do it. We just need the force to put it in play.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the weaponization of the addiction that you've talked about is not innocent. It's deliberately created. And you've written eloquently about that. Can you?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little depressing. We're part of the Canadian Psychological Association. Of course, psychology is all about learning and understanding human behavior, but part of that is prediction. And I can guarantee you there are a bunch of psychologists working for the betting agencies, because the way they market, absolutely by using people that we all like, leveraging superstars, but also just leveraging the common commentators that people have become, the voices of sports, and having those people sort of chime in and saying, even implying that betting seems okay. That's part of the whole normalization. They emphasize the short-term rewards. They always show people winning, and it's always fun, exciting. It's a nice little crowd around. So everything we know about the psychology of pushing somebody to do something, they put those all in the ads. And they even do things like, one of the ones I see that I think people have to really understand how sort of scary it is. They'll say, the first $5 you bet, we'll give you $50 extra to bet with. Wow, does that sound like a great deal, right? Why would anybody do that? Well, they would do that because A, they know you're going to lose that whole $50. And B, in the process of losing it, you are going to get a couple of wins. And those couple of wins are what are going to fuel you and make you want to chase more wins. And so, anybody looking at that math should say that seems wrong unless there's a real big hitch going on. And there is. It's a psychological hook that's there to get you tasting that. And they really target a lot of these ads primarily at the people most at risk. So we know from research that those most affected by the marketing are those people who are sort of at risk for addiction to begin with. And they're just feeding all of those mechanisms that those people respond to. And that's why we're seeing the rates increase so dramatically now. And it's really, it's time we do something about it here in Canada.
Yeah.
Steve, to what extent is this a men's problem? To what extent is this another expression of the crisis of masculinity? Men are overrepresented among those who are betting and way overrepresented among those who exhibit problem gambling.
Yeah. No, it is absolutely true. And it's partly linked to that expertise issue. There's this illusion of control, we call it, that when you think, I have an ability to control this because, and it's a lot of young men that watch sports so closely and they watch it. I've heard Bruce and I were on a podcast with the football coach for U of T. And he said when he recruits kids, he always asks them, hey, what team do you follow? What do you like? And he said, what he's hearing more and more now is kids are saying, I don't really follow a team. I follow individuals. And it's these individuals that they bet on. They become really fixated on these specific individual athletes. And so it's changing the way they're consuming the game totally. They're just looking for opportunities to potentially win or not. I want to relate one story just very quickly. We were at a Blue Jays game recently, and there was a bunch of young men ahead of us. And the opposing team was up. There was an out. They cheered. There was an out. They cheered. There was an out. They cheered. We were all cheering. And then our team came up and they got out and those guys cheered again. And the rest of us were like, what? And then the next person got out. They cheered. The next person got out and they went wild. Why? They had bet on 6 outs in a row. That's the kind of thing. So they probably won some huge amount. But to those of us who consider ourselves real fans, we're looking at them going, you're missing out. You've changed the whole way you're consuming sport and it's not nice. It's an ugly look when you see it.
If I can add another side of that, Steve, which is very worrying. The defenders talk about the excitement in sport and the new interest in sport generated by betting. But it's passive. It is, to the extent that it's physically active, it's fingers on a phone. And it's not the whole-bodied, aerobically demanding movement that we associate with sport. It's not the social activity that even in an individual sport, you involve other people. It's not the participation in a community with community values, community ethics. It's entirely by yourself or maybe a small group of people passively on their phones. We have a crisis of physical inactivity, which creates all kinds of health-related. And what is happening, although I haven't seen a good pan-Canadian study yet, is that participation is dropping even further with the rise of sports betting among the next generation. It's that I'm going to use that anecdote. People are not following real sport, and they're not being physically active in sport. They're following one or two players and quite abstract numbers, whether they're 6 outs in a row, in order to place their bets.
Right. It is. I've noticed this myself. I play fantasy football. I have a group of friends. We've had a league for 10, 15 years, so you follow individual players, but I'm watching football games. And I'm a Green Bay Packers fan, and I've learned over the years, I have to tell myself I will never draft a Green Bay Packers player to be on my fantasy team because it changes the way I watch those games. I want to watch those games from a pure standpoint of just, I want my team to win, and that's it. And then I thought about, what you were saying, Steve, the way they suck you in, right? Here's pay $5 and you get $50 free or whatever. And I saw one of those ads last night when I was watching the Blue Jays game. And I, for a moment, thought that to prepare for this podcast, I would download the app. And then every time they told me to bet or one of the announcers said something during the game, I would place that bet and see where I was at the end of it so that I could tell that story when I came. And then I thought, I'm not immune to this psychological stuff either. I'm too afraid to actually go ahead and start doing that, even for the purposes of an experiment,
Yeah, which is an important point to make because we often talk about the youth and absolutely the youth are disproportionately impacted by these ads. They're being targeted. They are the future gamblers and they want to keep fueling the system. But anybody's potentially affected by this. It's not only the youth that are affected. It's people really right across not just the age ranges, but also the socioeconomic ranges. It really is one of these things where you can almost say 1 in 5 people who flirt with the danger that you're talking about right now could end up finding themselves in a very uncomfortable position. And again, like, other addictions we think about, if you're drinking too much, okay, you have to deal with that issue. But if you've got a real problem with gambling, you don't just have that problem with gambling. You have the debt that you have piled up that you have to deal with in some way. And so it sort of adds an additional layer of embarrassment. It adds additional layer of complexity to the problem gambler. That's why suicide, 1 in 5 problem gamblers is planning suicide, literally has been planning out a suicide kind of ritual. That's the impact this has when it gets you. So I'm kind of glad you didn't, Eric, quite honestly, because, I can see the reason for doing it journalistically. I think it would be a good experiment for someone to do. I wouldn't do it. And I actually told my class, I'm a big Blue Jays fan. I've been wearing my jersey, and game 1 and 2 against Seattle, I was, before game 1 and 2, I was talking, I was sure we were just going to clobber them. And when I came back, I said, that's why I don't bet on sports, because I would have bet almost my house that the Blue Jays were going to beat them in game 1 and 2. And I would have lost, or all my expertise, everything I thought I knew going into that game turned out to be completely wrong. And yeah, it could have been something where I put in a big bet, and then that Monday morning, I'm like, oh my goodness, what have I done? And that's where a lot of people find themselves. It's just suddenly like, oh my, and by then they're in a lot of trouble.
And I feel like I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask anyway, right? Yeah. The debt that piles up, that being an additional burden on somebody who's in the throes of this problem. Yep. Does that at any point stop the behavior, or does it fuel the behavior? Like, is the only way to get out of debt to bet?
That's the path people follow for quite a while. And then even then the debt's so big, and that's where the family members come in. That's the, 4 to 5 to 8 other people that get impacted, because someone's got to get you out of that. But the real problem too then is assuming they get you out of that debt. The recidivism rate is like 90%. And right. Especially when you're bombarded by marketing, those people who've already been there and have sort of gotten out of it, they are the ones most susceptible to the marketing to just get right back into that behavior. So, even though they've gone through a horrible thing, even though they've had to get all their friends and family to help bail them out, they are very, very likely to just jump right back into that hole. And, that's why we don't want to start indoctrinating our youth to think it's not dangerous. That's really, by banning the marketing of something, we can send a message to say, hey, if you want to do it, you can do it. We're not going to prevent you from doing it, but we're not going to condone it. And we're certainly not going to push you to it. And that's how we should be treating things that are dangerous, because that alone signals, like with THC, you have this clear signal out there that, yeah, you can go ahead and buy it, but there's a risk. We need to do that with sports gambling, where the risk is so much higher than THC. If we're going to do it for that, we should certainly be doing it for this.
Right. And we very much accepted that we don't advertise cigarettes anymore, and that there's restrictions around advertising alcohol. You can't show somebody actually drinking in a commercial and that kind of thing. Right. Like right. We've accepted that over the years. And I kind of feel like this is going to be a little more of a heavy lift, because it has been so sudden that we accepted for many, many years that we didn't advertise gambling. And now I cannot turn on the TV without seeing it. Right. It's so sudden that it may be a tougher or longer term thing. But what can people do? We'll put all the links in the show notes here so people can go to ban ads for gambling, and also write your MP about the bill that we'll also put. I think Marty Deacon is the sponsor of that. We'll put it in the show notes as well. What else can people do?
I think there are other policy things that you can do. I would ban prop bets. So it's no longer legal to place a bet on whether there'll be 6 consecutive outs in a game. I don't think that has anything to do with sports. It's like a lottery. I would do that. I would, for other reasons, I would limit the sports on which bets can be placed. And I would say that you can't bet. I mean, the betting companies are parasites. They're free riders. They place bets on sports and athletes, in many cases, certainly in university and minor leagues, without the permission of those teams and those players. I would make a requirement that no bets can be placed on a team or an athlete without a written agreement where the athlete has been involved in its negotiation. That, for those of us in the university where we see bets being placed on intercollegiate sport, that should simply be prohibited. And if there is a record of that, then the university should sue those companies from accepting those bets. There's got to be some limits to what's going on in this industry.
And for the general public, let me say, so I threw out a while ago, Bruce had sent me a little article about sports betting, and it had the rhetorical question, where is the outcry? Where, highlighted the problem. Why are people not upset? So I was trying to push people to talk about this with the hashtag We the Outcry. And, if we all, however, social media, whatever you do stuff, if you add that hashtag We the Outcry, that at least gives us a chance to kind of see and bring together the people that are interested. The other thing I would say is, Bruce mentioned he's retired. I'm not that far from it. We are not really, Bruce and I are not really.
It ain't so, Steve.
Yeah, it is so. But so many of the students in my class, the 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds, they're seeing this problem. This is their friends. They see it in school. They've seen people betting as young as 15, etc. They probably know things Bruce and I don't. And so what I would ask is, hey, if you think this is an important issue, if you want to join with us, we could really, really use some young people. We could really use some athletes.
It would be nice to see some top athletes come out against the marketing and gambling to children. I remember once thinking prop bets were kind of cute. They seemed to exist only during the Super Bowl, when millions of people who weren't otherwise football fans would tune in, and maybe they could root for the color of Gatorade or the length of the national anthem or whether Kendrick Lamar would perform Not Like Us at halftime. But they've become so much more insidious, pervasive, and so common that it seems like decades since prop bets were a novelty. Now, for more information, to read Senator Marty Deacon's bill, and to join up with Bruce and Steve and the rest of the campaign to ban gambling ads, check out the links in the show notes. My thanks to Steve and Bruce for joining me once again to highlight this issue. As Steve said, with all the terrible things happening in the world right now, this is one we can actually do something about. And thanks to you at home for listening, streaming, and downloading today's episode. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our producer and editor is Jamie Montgomery. And our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.